By the morning of October 12, 1944, somewhere along the Patapsco River in Maryland, the night shift at a wartime shipyard finished their count and came up one man short. They found his tool belt coiled neat on a bench near the riveter's alley, still warm to the touch. They found the dog that slept beside him every night, Barge, a brindle mastiff the size of a man's torso, loyal as a brother and steady as brick, gone without a sound. The chain that tethered him to the iron post lay slack across the pavement in a perfect curve, and when the first man bent to lift it, the links were warm as a handled wrench. But there were no boot prints in the coal grit, no paw marks in the dust, and the rivet bucket someone had left against the wall had slid 2 feet uphill and stopped, its handle pointing toward the dark mouth of the alley, where the fog sat thick and low and would not lift even after sunrise. The yard sat on the south edge of the river, just past the old ferry landing, where the water ran slow and gray and the air tasted of salt and bunker oil and hot metal. Men worked there in shifts around the clock, building Liberty ships for the war effort, welding plate after plate under arc lamps that burned white and left purple shadows in your eyes long after you looked away. It was loud work, dirty work, the kind that ground men down to bone and kept them coming back because the pay was steady, and the nation needed hulls in the water faster than the enemy could sink them. By October of '44, the yard employed nearly 20,000 souls, most of them working under blackout conditions after dark, their lamps hooded, their voices low, the whole operation running like a held breath in case enemy scouts were watching from the bay. The man who went missing that night was named Harlan Kress. He was 31 years old, a riveter by trade, and he had worked the yard since the spring of '42. He was known as a man who showed up on time, kept his tools clean, and never missed a shift unless his daughter took sick, which happened twice that year, and both times he told his foreman a week in advance. He lived in a row house 6 blocks north of the yard with his wife, his daughter, and his wife's mother, and every night before he left for the late shift, he kissed his daughter's forehead and told her he would see her at breakfast. On the night of October 11th, he did the same. His wife watched him walk down the front steps in his heavy coat and canvas gloves, his lunch pail swinging, and she bolted the door behind him as she always did during the blackout hours. That was the last time anyone saw Harlan Kress walking on his own feet. Barge was not Harlan's dog. He belonged to the yard or to no one, depending on who you asked. He had shown up one winter as a pup, skinny and shivering near the coal pile, and the night crew fed him scraps until he grew large enough to scare off the rats. By the time Harlan started working nights, Barge had claimed the riveter's alley as his territory, and he slept there every shift, his head on his paws, his eyes half open, watching the men come and go. Harlan was the one who brought him water in a dented can. Harlan was the one who scratched behind his ears and spoke to him in the low, steady voice he used with his daughter when she woke from bad dreams. The dog learned to wait for him. When Harlan's boots hit the pavement at the start of a shift, Barge would lift his head and thump his tail twice, and that was greeting enough for both of them. On the night of the 11th, the yard ran a blackout drill just after midnight. The order came down from the harbor master by radio, all external lights off, all movement stilled, total silence for 10 minutes while coastal patrol made their pass. The arc lamps went dark. The generators throttled down, the riveters stopped mid-swing, and the welders killed their torches, and the whole yard fell into a blackness so complete that men standing 3 feet apart could not see each other's faces. It was in that silence, in that dark, that Barge stood. Several men heard it. The scrape of his claws on the pavement, the soft jingle of his chain. One of them, a welder named Phipps, said later that he heard the dog prick his ears, the way a hound does when it catches a scent or a sound too faint for human ears. Then Barge walked. Not fast, not in alarm, just steady, the way a dog walks when called by someone it trusts. His chain stretched taut for a single heartbeat. Then it fell slack. When the lights came back on 10 minutes later, the dog was gone. Harlan Kress was gone. The chain lay in that perfect curve, warm as skin, and the rivet bucket had moved. Men swore it had been flush against the wall when the drill started. Now it sat 2 feet away, tilted slightly uphill on a slope so gradual most men would not notice it unless they laid a level across the ground. But the bucket had moved, and it had moved up. They searched that night with covered lamps, the beams narrow and dim, painting long stretches of shadow across the walls of the alley. In the glow, vapor rose from the bare bricks as though the walls were breathing, even though the October air was cold enough to sting the throat. One man called Harlan's name. Another whistled for the dog. No answer came. They found Harlan's tool belt on the bench, buckle still fastened, leather still warm. They found paw prints across a fresh paint stripe that the day crew had laid down only hours before, the paint still tacky. The prints were large and deep, the kind a dog the size of Barge would leave, and they walked in a straight line toward the back of the alley, where a steel door stood shut and latched from the outside. The prints stopped at the shadow of that door. They did not turn. They did not scatter. They simply ended as though the dog had walked through the door without opening it, or as though the door had opened and closed again without anyone touching the latch. By dawn, the yardmaster had doubled the patrols and posted a man at each alley mouth, with orders to check every worker leaving the premises. They brought in dogs from the harbor patrol, German shepherds trained to track, and the dogs pulled hard on their leads until they reached the mouth of the Riveter's alley. Then they stopped. They sat. They whined low in their throats and would not go farther no matter how their handlers urged them. One of the shepherds lay flat on the pavement and tucked its nose under its paws, shaking. At 7 that morning, a machinist named Rudd found Barge's brass tag lying on a workbench near the welding station, a bench that had been cleared and inspected twice during the night search. The tag was cold to the hand, cold enough that Rudd pulled his fingers back and blew on them, but when he lifted the tag with the edge of a rag and turned it over, they saw the burn mark it had left in the varnish of the bench. A perfect oval, black at the edges, still smoking faintly in the morning air. The tag was engraved with the dog's name and the year he had been claimed by the yard. Rudd set it down carefully and no one touched it again. The hooter that called the shifts, a steam-powered horn mounted on the roof of the main shed, loud enough to be heard 3 miles downriver, refused to sound that morning. The engineer climbed up and checked the valve. The boiler pressure was strong, the steam line was clear. But when he pulled the cord, nothing came out but a thin hiss, as though something in the throat of the horn had gone soft. He tried twice more, then gave up. The foreman rang the shift change with a handbell instead, and men filed out in silence, their faces turned away from the Riveter's alley. After that day, the whistles stayed silent. The yardmaster ordered the hooter repaired, but the engineer said there was nothing wrong with it that he could see. It simply would not blow. The men did not ask him to try again. They preferred the quiet. At night, when the fog came in heavy off the Patapsco and the welding light flickered behind hooded lamps, the workers on the late shift walked in pairs. They did not call out to one another across the yard. They did not whistle for the dog that used to sleep in the Riveter's alley, and when the coastal patrol ran their blackout drills, the men stood still in the dark and listened. And sometimes they heard a soft sound like claws on pavement or the low jingle of a chain coming from a direction they could not name. But no one turned toward it. No one answered. And no one in Maryland, not then, not now, walks that alley alone after the lamps go dark. The last man to see Harlan Kress standing on his own feet was a crane operator named Dulles, and he saw him at 11:43 on the night of October 11th. 3 minutes before the yardmaster's office radioed the blackout order. Dulles was walking the catwalk above the main assembly floor when he looked down and saw Harlan near the Riveter's alley, crouched beside Barge, one hand on the dog's shoulder. He was just talking to him, Dulles said later, his voice flat. The way you talk to a dog, quiet, nothing strange about it. Dulles turned away to check a crane cable, and when he looked back down 2 minutes later, the lights went out for the drill. He never saw Harlan again. The blackout lasted 10 minutes. The standing order during drills was simple. Stop where you are, stay silent, do not light a match or a cigarette, do not move unless you are told. Most men froze in place. A few crouched low near the machinery where they had been working. Harlan had been near the alley. Barge had been chained to the post just inside it. When the lights came back on at 12:13, both were gone. The chain was warm, the tool belt was warm, and the rivet bucket had moved uphill. By 12:30, the foreman had counted heads 3 times. Harlan Kress was the only man missing. They sent 2 workers to his house to see if he had gone home sick. His wife came to the door in her nightgown, her face tight with confusion, and said he had left for his shift at 10:45 as he always did. She asked if something had happened. The men told her they were just checking. They did not tell her that her husband had vanished in the dark, and they did not tell her about the dog. The first search began just after 1 in the morning. 12 men, all from Harlan's crew, walked the yard in pairs with covered lanterns, checking the alleys, the storage sheds, the coal bins, the narrow gap between the plate stacks where men sometimes went to smoke. They called his name. They checked the dry docks. They walked the edge of the river where the water lapped soft and black against the pilings, and they shone their lights across the surface, looking for movement, for ripples, for anything that did not belong. They found nothing. One of them, a man named Howell, said he heard a low whistle while they were walking the south end of the yard, a 2-note call like the kind cattlemen use, short and sharp. "I thought it was one of the other guys," he said. But when I turned around, nobody was behind me. The whistle came from ahead past the coal shed, but there was nobody there when I got to it. By 3 in the morning, the search had grown. The yardmaster pulled men from the graveyard shift and organized them into a grid. They walked shoulder to shoulder across the open ground between the sheds, their boots crunching on coal grit and metal shavings. They tied white rag strips to the fence posts as they went, marking each section they had covered. The dogs from the harbor patrol arrived just before 4. The handlers were confident. The shepherds were trained for water recovery and had worked drownings up and down the Patapsco for 2 years. But when the first dog reached the mouth of the Riveter's Alley, it stopped so suddenly that the handler stumbled. The dog sat. It whined. It would not go forward. The handler tried to coax it, then tried to drag it, and finally the dog lay flat on the ground and tucked its head under its paws, shaking. The second dog did the same. The third refused to come within 10 feet of the alley and pulled so hard on the lead that the handler had to brace his weight to keep from being dragged backward. "Something about that alley," the handler said, standing in the pale wash of a work light. "They won't go near it. I've never seen them do this." By dawn, they had searched every accessible part of the yard twice. They had checked the tool sheds, the offices, the latrines, the mess hall, the infirmary. They had sent men down into the bilges of 2 ships under construction, slippery and dark and stinking of oil. They had dragged hooks through the shallow water along the docks. They had climbed the gantry cranes and looked down from above, scanning the yard for any shape that did not belong. Harlan Cress was not there. Barge was not there. And still, no one could explain how a man and a dog could vanish from a yard full of workers in the span of 10 minutes in the dark without a sound. At 8 that morning, a rigger named Pratt went back to the Riveter's Alley to check the area in daylight. He walked slowly, his eyes on the ground, looking for anything the night search might have missed. Near the back wall, he found a second white rag strip tied to a pipe bracket, fluttering in the breeze. He stopped. He called over his shoulder to the foreman. "Who tied this one?" The foreman came over, looked at it, and shook his head. "Nobody. We only marked the outer posts. We didn't mark anything inside the alleys." Pratt untied the rag and held it up. It was clean. It was dry. It looked exactly like the strips they had been using. But no one remembered tying it there. And when they checked the other alleys, they found 2 more strips, both tied in places the search crews swore they had not touched. That afternoon, the yardmaster brought in a city detective, a man named Oakes who had worked missing persons cases before the war, and now handled labor disputes and theft on the docks. Oakes walked the yard for 2 hours, asking questions, taking notes in a small black book. He spoke to Dulles. He spoke to Phipps, the welder who had heard the dog stand during the blackout. He spoke to Howell, who had heard the whistle near the coal shed. He examined the tool belt. He examined the chain. He looked at the burn mark on the workbench where the dog's tag had been found, and he crouched there for a long time, staring at it, saying nothing. Finally, he stood, closed his notebook, and told the yardmaster he would file a report. He did not say what he thought had happened. He did not say whether he believed Harlan Cress had left the yard on his own or been taken. He left just before sunset, and no one saw him return. By the 3rd night, the older hands in Maryland, the men who had worked the river docks and the shipyards and the canneries for 20 or 30 years, The ones who remembered when the Patapsco froze solid in the winter of 21, and when the hurricane of 33 took 4 men off a barge in water calm as a mill pond. Those men began to talk among themselves in low voices during the smoke breaks. They did not talk loud enough for the younger workers to hear, but the younger ones noticed the way the old men looked at the Riveter's Alley and the way they walked past it without turning their heads. One of the old men, a shipfitter named Carrick, pulled his nephew aside on the 4th day and told him flatly, "You don't go down that alley alone. You don't go there after dark, and if you hear a dog, you don't follow it." The nephew asked why. Carrick did not answer. He just looked at him until the boy nodded and walked away. On the 5th night, a maintenance worker named Tully was walking the catwalk near the welding station when he saw a light moving inside the Riveter's Alley. It was faint, the kind of glow an oil lamp makes when the wick is turned low. Tully stopped. He leaned over the rail and called down, "Who's there?" No answer. The light moved slowly, drifting toward the back of the alley, then stopped near the steel door. Tully climbed down the ladder and walked toward the alley entrance, his own lamp held high. By the time he reached the mouth of the alley, the light was gone. He stepped inside. The air was warmer than it should have been. He could feel it on his face, a dry warmth like standing near a stove, even though there was no stove, no fire, no machinery running. He took 3 more steps and smelled something sharp and metallic, the way iron smells when it has been heated and then cooled fast. He turned and walked back out. He did not go in again. By the end of the 1st week, there was nowhere left to walk that did not already hold their boot prints, and still nobody had found Harlan Kress. His wife came to the yard once, escorted by a foreman, and stood at the gate looking in. She asked to see where her husband had been working. They walked her to the Riveter's Alley but stopped her at the entrance. She stared into it for a long time, her hands folded in front of her, her face pale and still. "He wouldn't just leave," she said quietly. "He'd never leave us." Then she turned and walked back to the gate, and one of the men drove her home. She did not come back. On the 8th night, the dogs started again. Not the patrol shepherds, the neighborhood dogs. The mutts and hounds that lived in the row houses and the tenements 6 blocks north of the yard. They started barking just after midnight, all of them at once, a ragged chorus that woke half the block. They barked for 3 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as they had started. In the silence that followed, a woman standing on her stoop 2 streets over swore she heard the jingle of a chain, faint and rhythmic like a dog walking on pavement. But when she looked, the street was empty, and when she went back inside and locked her door, the sound was still there, softer now, coming from a direction she could not name. By the 10th day, the search had become something else. It was no longer a rescue. It was no longer an investigation. It had become a ritual, performed by men who no longer believed they would find Harlan Kress alive, but who could not stop looking because stopping would mean admitting that something in the yard had taken him, and they did not know what it was, or whether it might take someone else. They walked the grid every morning before the day shift started. They marked each section with chalk on the pavement. They checked the same sheds, the same tanks, the same crawl spaces they had checked a dozen times before. And every evening, when the light failed and the fog rolled in from the Patapsco, they posted 2 men at the mouth of the Riveter's Alley with strict orders. "Watch, but do not enter." The yardmaster, a man named Blanchard who had run the facility since 42 and prided himself on maintaining order even under wartime pressure, stopped sleeping. His secretary said he spent his nights in the office poring over shift logs and blueprints, trying to find some pattern, some explanation that would let him file a report and close the case. He could not. On the 12th day, he called a meeting in the main shed and stood before 100 men and told them in a voice scraped raw that Harlan Kress was officially listed as missing, that the search would continue on a reduced schedule, and that production could not stop because the war could not stop. The men listened in silence. When Blanchard finished, no one moved. No one spoke. Finally, an older riveter named Gann stood and said quietly, "We're not asking to stop work. We're asking you to close that alley." Blanchard stared at him. "Close it?" Gann nodded. "Board it up. Nobody goes in. Nobody works there. You leave it alone." Blanchard did not answer. But 2 days later, a work crew nailed sheets of plywood across the entrance to the Riveter's Alley, and the men went back to their shifts without another word. On the morning of the 14th day, a clerk named Iris Gould was filing time cards in the yard office when she found something that should not have been there. It was a small slip of paper, a standard work order, filled out in pencil. The handwriting was neat and slanted slightly to the right. The order was dated October 12, 1944, the day after Harlan disappeared. It was signed at the bottom in the same handwriting, H. Kress. Iris stared at it. She read it twice, then she stood, walked to Blanchard's office and set it on his desk without a word. Blanchard picked it up. He looked at the signature. He looked at the date. His hands began to shake. "Where did you find this?" he asked. Iris pointed toward the filing cabinet. "In the completed orders, it was in the stack for the 12th. Blanchard stood and walked to the cabinet. He pulled the drawer open and flipped through the cards. The order should not have been there. The cards were filed by date, and every order in that drawer had been logged and verified. Blanchard had checked them himself on the morning of the 13th, looking for any sign that Harlan had clocked in or out, any mark that might tell him where the man had gone. The work order had not been there then. He was certain of it. He called in Phipps, the welder, and showed him the slip. Phipps looked at the handwriting and nodded slowly. "That's his," he said. "I've seen him write 100 times. That's Harlan." Blanchard asked him to read the order aloud. Phipps hesitated, then read, "Inspect weld seams, hull 4, lower deck. Check steam line coupling, aft section. Report any gaps." He set the paper down. "That's standard work. Nothing strange about it." Blanchard pointed to the date. He couldn't have written this on the 12th. He was already gone. Phipps said nothing. He stared at the paper, his jaw tight, and then he walked out of the office and did not come back. By that afternoon, the word had spread through the yard. Men gathered in small groups during the breaks, speaking in low voices, and the story grew with each telling. Some said the work order had been found inside a sealed file cabinet that Blanchard kept locked. Others said it had been pinned to the bulletin board in the foreman's shed, where everyone could see it, even though no one remembered seeing it there before. A few said the handwriting was not quite right, that the slant was too steep, that the letters were too careful, as though someone had been copying Harlan's hand from memory. But most of the men who had worked with him said the signature was his. They knew it the way you know a man's walk, or the sound of his voice. And that made it worse. The theories came slowly at first, whispered over coffee and cigarettes, traded between men who trusted each other enough to speak the unspeakable. Some said Harlan had enemies. He was quiet, but he had worked the docks before the war, and the docks were rough. Maybe someone had settled an old score. Maybe he had been lured into the alley and killed, and maybe the dog had followed, loyal to the end. But no one could explain the warm chain. No one could explain the boot prints that ended at the door, or the rivet bucket that moved uphill, or the work order that appeared 2 weeks after the man who wrote it had vanished. Others said the land was wrong. The yard sat on fill, dredged up from the riverbed and packed down over old marsh and old pilings that dated back to the 1700s. Before the war, before the shipyard, the site had been a brickworks, and before that a tannery, and before that a fever hospital that burned in 1873 and took 23 souls with it. "The ground don't forget," one of the old men said, his voice flat and certain. "You build on top of what was there, but it don't forget. And sometimes it wants something back." A few, the ones who would not say it loud but who looked at the Riveter's Alley with something close to dread, whispered that it was not a man who had brought the herd home, except there was no herd in this story, only a dog and a man, and 10 minutes of blackout dark. They whispered that something had called to Harlan in the silence, something that knew his voice or his habits or the way he moved through the yard every night. They whispered that the dog had heard it first, and that Harlan had followed, not because he was afraid, but because he trusted what he heard. And whatever had called to him had taken him somewhere the searchers could not reach, somewhere close enough to leave a work order on a desk but far enough that no lamp could find him. Blanchard tried to stop the talk. He posted notices reminding workers that speculation was not evidence, that rumors hurt morale, and that the matter was still under investigation by city authorities. But the city detective, Oakes, had not returned. When Blanchard called his office, a clerk told him that Oakes had requested reassignment and was no longer working cases on the waterfront. No reason given. Blanchard hung up the phone and sat in his office with the work order in front of him. And for the first time since the yard opened, he considered shutting it down. On the 16th night, the dog's tag reappeared. A night watchman named Kohler found it lying on the same workbench where it had been found before, near the welding station, 15 feet from the boarded-up entrance to the Riveter's Alley. Kohler swore the bench had been empty when he walked past it 20 minutes earlier. He swore he had checked it with his flashlight the way he checked every surface on his rounds, looking for tools left out or cigarettes still burning. The tag had not been there. Now it was. And it was warm. Not hot. Not burning. Just warm, the way metal gets when it sits in the sun or when someone has been holding it in their hand for a long time. Kohler did not touch it. He backed away slowly, his light still on it, and he called for the other watchman on duty. The two of them stood there staring at the tag until the shift horn blew at 6 and the day crew arrived. One of the day workers, a man named Rudge, finally picked it up with a pair of pliers and dropped it into a tin box. He sealed the lid and carried the box to Blanchard's office. Blanchard opened it once, looked inside, and closed it again. He locked the box in his desk drawer and told no one where he put the key. After that week, nobody in Maryland took the river path alone before dawn. Nobody answered if they heard a whistle in the fog. And nobody, not the old hands or the new hires or the city men brought in to check the wiring and the steam lines, spoke Harlan Cress's name aloud inside the yard after dark. The women who lived in the row houses 6 blocks north told their children not to walk past the shipyard fence, even in daylight, even with friends. The priests at St. Casimir's, the parish nearest the river, added Harlan's name to the prayer list and left it there for 10 years, long after the war ended and the yard closed and the neighborhood forgot most of what had happened that October. But the old men remembered, and when the young ones were hired on at the new plants and the new docks that opened along the Patapsco in the 50s, the old men pulled them aside and told them the same thing Carrick had told his nephew in 44. You don't go alone. You don't follow sounds you can't see, and if something feels warm that should be cold, you walk away and you do not look back. By the end of October, the plywood boards across the Riveter's Alley had been reinforced with 2x4s and painted over with the same gray paint the yard used on the hull plates. No signs were posted, no warnings were written. But every worker understood. The alley was closed and it would stay closed, and no one asked why. Production continued. Ships slid down the ways into the Patapsco on schedule. The war demanded steel, and the yard delivered it. But the men worked differently now. They walked in pairs after dark. They kept their voices low during the blackout drills. And when the shift horn finally blew again, the engineers had replaced the hooter with a smaller bell mounted on the roof of the main shed. The sound was thin and flat, and it did not carry the way the old horn had. No one complained. The silence was easier. Harlan Cress's wife stayed in the row house for another year, waiting. The yard sent her his final paycheck and a letter of condolence that named him missing, not dead, because no body had been found, and no evidence of foul play had been confirmed. She cashed the check. She kept the letter in a drawer. On the first anniversary of his disappearance, she packed what she could carry, took her daughter and her mother, and moved west to her sister's place in Pennsylvania. Before she left, she went to the yard one last time and asked Blanchard if they had found anything new. He told her no. She asked if they were still looking. He did not answer. She nodded, thanked him, and walked out. The house stayed empty for 3 years, then was sold to a machinist who had just come back from the Pacific and did not know the story. When the neighbors told him, he shrugged and said he had seen worse, but he never walked past the shipyard after dark, and he never let his children play near the fence. By 1946, the war was over and the yard was winding down. The contracts dried up. The workforce shrank from 20,000 to 5,000, then to hundreds. The big sheds went quiet. The cranes stopped moving. Blanchard retired and moved to Florida, and the new yardmaster, a man from Philadelphia who had never worked the Patapsco, toured the facility in his first week and asked why one of the alleys was boarded up. The foreman who walked him through, an old riveter named Doane, told him it was unsafe. The new manager asked what was unsafe about it. Doan looked at him for a long moment and said, "The ground's bad. We don't use it." The manager pressed. Doan stopped walking, turned, and said flatly, "You want to open it, you open it yourself. I'm not sending men in there." The manager did not open it. He left it boarded, and when the yard finally closed for good in 1951, the plywood was still there, weathered gray and warped by rain, and no one ever took it down. The building stood empty for a decade. Scrappers came and went, stripping copper and brass and anything else they could sell. They took the cranes, they took the gantries, they took the tie rails and the piping and the light fixtures, but they did not touch the boards across the riveter's alley. One scrapper, a man named Hoyt who worked the waterfront for 30 years, said he had pried up the first board and looked inside with a flashlight. He said the air inside was warmer than the air outside, even though it was January and the building had no heat. He said he saw boot prints in the dust leading toward the back wall and the prints looked fresh. He put the board back and left. When another scrapper asked him why he did not finish the job, Hoyt said, "Some places you don't go. I don't care what's in there. I don't care what it's worth. You leave it alone." In 1958, the city raised the shipyard to make room for new commercial development. The demolition crew worked through the site in sections, tearing down the sheds, breaking up the concrete slabs, hauling away the rubble. When they reached the building that had housed the riveter's alley, the crew foreman, a man named Vickers, asked the city inspector if there were any restricted areas. The inspector checked his map and said no. Vickers nodded and sent his men in with sledgehammers and pry bars. They tore down the boards across the alley entrance and stepped inside. The alley was empty. No tools, no machinery. Nothing but dust and brick, and the steel door at the back, rusted shut. One of the workers, a young man named Lot, walked to the door and tried the handle. It would not turn. He hit it with a hammer. The door rang like a bell, one clear note that hung in the air longer than it should have. Lot stepped back. He looked at the floor. There were no boot prints, no paw prints, just smooth dust, undisturbed, as though no one had walked there in years, but near the center of the alley, lying in a small clear space, was a brass tag. Lot picked it up. It was cold at first. Then, as he held it, it began to warm in his hand. He read the engraving. Barge, 1942. He dropped it. The tag hit the concrete with a soft clink and did not bounce. Lot backed out of the alley and told Vickers he was not going back in. Vickers went in himself, found the tag, and put it in his pocket. By the time he got back to his truck an hour later, the tag was gone. He checked his pocket 3 times. It was not there. He never told the crew. The site was cleared by the end of the year. The city built a warehouse on the footprint of the old yard, and the warehouse stood for 20 years before it was torn down and replaced with a parking lot. The parking lot is still there. People park their cars on it every day and walk to the offices and shops along the waterfront, and most of them do not know what used to stand there, or what happened there, or why the old men in the neighborhood still will not walk across that lot after the sun goes down. But the old men remember, and they still tell the younger ones, "You do not go there alone. You do not answer whistles you cannot see, and if you find something that should not be warm, you leave it where it lies." In 2003, a historical society in Baltimore published a book on the wartime shipyards of the Chesapeake, and in one chapter they mentioned the disappearance of Harlan Cress. They listed it as an unsolved case, possibly a workplace accident, possibly foul play, the details lost to time. They did not mention the dog. They did not mention the warm chain, or the work order, or the tag that appeared and disappeared and appeared again. They did not mention that the men who worked the yard in '44 still refused to talk about it on record, or that some of them, interviewed in their 80s and 90s, would only say, "We lost a man there. That's all I'll tell you. You want to know more, you go walk that alley yourself." The historians did not walk it. There was nothing left to walk. But the memory stayed. People in Maryland still tell the story, especially around Dundalk and Turner Station and the old waterfront neighborhoods where the shipyard workers used to live. They tell it carefully, the way you tell a story that might still be listening. They do not say Harlan's name out loud unless they have to. They do not laugh when they talk about the dog. And when someone new moves into the area and asks why the older residents avoid the lot where the shipyard used to be, they are told the same thing Carrick told his nephew in 1944. Some places take, and they do not give back, and you do not test them to see if the stories are true. The children growing up there now do not know Harlan Cress. They do not know Barge. But they know the rule, and they follow it, the way their parents followed it, the way their grandparents followed it, because the rule is older than memory and stronger than proof, and it has kept people safe for 80 years. There are 3 versions of what happened that night in October of 1944. The first version says Harlan had enemies, that someone lured him into the alley during the blackout and killed him, that the body was dumped in the river, and the dog was taken or shot and buried somewhere no one would find it. This version makes sense. It fits the facts. It requires no impossible things, but it does not explain the warm chain, or the tag that reappeared, or the work order written in Harlan's hand the day after he vanished. The second version says it was an accident. Harlan fell, or the dog dragged him, or he wandered into a space he should not have entered and became trapped, and the body was never recovered because the yard was large and chaotic and full of places a man could disappear. This version is possible. It is reasonable. But it does not explain the boot prints that stopped at the door, or the rivet bucket that moved uphill, or the warmth that lingered in objects that had no reason to be warm. The third version is the one nobody in Maryland says out loud, but it is the one they believe. It says that something in the yard called to Harlan during the blackout, something that knew his habits and his voice and the way he moved through the dark. It says the dog heard it first and stood, and Harlan followed, not out of fear but out of trust, because whatever called to him sounded like something he knew. It says the thing that called him was not human, and it was not kind, and it took him somewhere the searchers could not reach, somewhere close enough to leave a brass tag on a bench, close enough to write a work order in his handwriting, close enough to warm a chain and move a bucket and make the air inside an empty alley feel like breath. This version does not make sense, but it is the version that explains everything. Which version fits the details here? The human one, the accidental one, or the impossible one that people in Maryland still will not name out loud even now, 80 years later, when the yard is gone and the men who worked it are dead, and all that is left is a parking lot and a rule that nobody breaks? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.